So we've been discussing 2 days ago the basics of private sector engagement. Today we're going to dig a little bit deeper into stakeholder mapping. So I'm sure that you are already familiar with the concept and have used in your day-to-day job a variety of tools and frameworks already. So what we're going to do today is try to look at two examples to bring a little bit of perspective as to how stakeholder engagement works, what is the role of private sector, and what benefit we can derive from collaboration with private sector. And then we're gonna get a chance to discuss in breakout groups to try to get a little bit of perspective from the participants on their experience basically with landscape approaches and stakeholder engagement to see what have been the challenges, successes, and how we can help each other basically to better apprehend the needs of stakeholder mapping and especially private sector engagement. So the first case that we thought was interesting to highlight, it's something that we've had the chance to see a presentation of a couple of days ago with Andika, is Rimba Collective. And it's interesting, even though this is not per se a landscape approach or a landscape tool, it's actually a mechanism that fits very well within landscape approach. So it brings funding towards specific activities within the landscape, and notably conservation and restoration. So it's a tool that can enable landscape practitioners to leverage more private finance towards conservation and restoration goals. And that's interesting in many ways, but especially because the Rimba Collective is articulated around the common entry point, which is nature positive impact, restoration, conservation, and reconciles perspectives and constraints that are different from civil society and private sector. So civil society is facing some issues with the structure of conservation funding, which is usually mostly dependent on philanthropy, on public funding, on donor funding, which usually lasts for a few years, whereas the needs of conservation and restoration are generational. So you need to have visibility on long-term funding if you are to engage local communities and landscape stakeholders effectively in the long term. So this mechanism allows them to access long-term financing against agreed conservation and restoration outcomes. On the other hand, for the private sector and those 4 companies that have founded the Rimba Collective, it allows them basically to translate their corporate pledge and commitment into concrete results. It's difficult for these companies to work with 10 or 50 local organizations to fund well-designed conservation project. So they need a mechanism to allow for integration, aggregation, to allow for reaching a scale that make it economically viable for them to invest into a large-scale portfolio. So as you can imagine, the process for developing a partnership like that requires a great deal of not only research, data collection to understand how the supply chain works, but also a lot of consultation to make sure that private sector companies, civil society organizations, government agencies alike are all aligned and supportive of this kind of project. Another interesting case to look into that is very much landscape and commodity related is the Green Cocoa Landscape Partnership in Cameroon that we can see on the next slide. So it's interesting because it was initially based on the perception by the government of Cameroon that cocoa is a strategic sector for the country, that it brings a lot of revenues for the country, but especially when looking at strategies to support rural economies and development, cacao is a very strategic commodity to look into. So the government decided to invest heavily in the modernization of the cacao sector to make sure it becomes more productive, but also that the risk associated with the production of cacao, be it environmental and social, can be addressed to protect the natural capital and social capital of the country, but also to make sure that the sector remains or retain access to a market that is more and more demanding in terms of social and environmental impact. So in a way, this aligns very well with the agenda of chocolate companies, who are also under more and more pressure to provide living income, to provide assurance against zero deforestation, child labor, and so on, which will require a coordinated approach between the different companies in the value chain and in partnership with government agencies and local governments and local NGOs. So they were actually from the design of the program, they were already included in the consultation, and they were an integral part of the multi-stakeholder platform. So for the private sector, it made a lot of sense to be part of this initiative because it allowed them, as I said before, to better manage the supply chain risk associated with cacao production. It allows them also to improve or strengthen supply security by improving productivity and making sure that cacao production is more resilient to extreme weather, that basically the supply of cacao is guaranteed for the long term. It gives them also an opportunity to co-design and have some degree of ownership as to how policies and programs are shaped in the cacao sector. And it allows them also to access new streams of finance from government sources, from philanthropies, donors, and so on. So it can unlock new opportunities for them to actually invest in their supply chain. Last and not least, it also allows them to be involved in the discussion related to policy for the cacao sector. So what kind of safeguards will be in place to have a say also in how the landscape is being zoned and so on. So for civil society, it also made sense to work in alignment with the private sector, because for them it unlocks also new resources, new sources of funding, and also because having the private sector within the multi-stakeholder platform allows also to have additional influence and leverage with, for example, the government, because those companies bring significant resources to the country, they create jobs and so on. They can have a different kind of narrative and influence over government planning and policy development. And also, I mean, it contributes to have a more efficient and more productive value chain that will bring benefits to the local communities. So just to say that, looking at those two examples, you can imagine that this kind of mapping and strategy for stakeholder engagement, there is a lot of work behind that in terms of research, but also in terms of consultation, in terms of identifying potential alignment for strategic engagement. So it's not something you can do on a whiteboard in a few hours. So there is a lot of work behind that. And that is the key to successful landscape approach, is to make sure that you have first clear entry points. What are the issues that can federate different actors with different agendas around the common vision, and that you can identify strategies as to how to get the right message to the right stakeholder to make sure that you can generate support for the approach. So yeah, just to give you a little bit of example on how this works in practice. Now, if we look at the more theoretical framework on stakeholder mapping, so again, I won't give you a lecture because I think everybody is quite familiar, but we can summarize that in three basic steps: brainstorming, mapping, and analysis. So what we mean by brainstorming is basically coming up with a long list of stakeholders. And as we've discussed 2 days ago, it's important to understand who has influence over and is impacted by the landscape in question, and not to limit ourselves to the physical boundaries of the landscape, meaning that, for example, chocolate companies that are not physically based in Cameroon, for example, they will have a lot of interest and influence to actually intervene in the landscape, because that's where their supply chain is located. Similarly, financial institutions will have also influence over the actors in the landscape. So it's important to look not only at who is physically managing land, but also who are the actors throughout the value chain that can influence the process. Then for the mapping, I mean, there are also a variety of tools. So what we usually use, that we can see in the next slide. Next one, sorry. Is basically to try to regroup the stakeholders according to various criteria or categories. So and to make sure we have a little bit more clarity as to what is the role and incentives of each stakeholder. So we start by looking at the broader category. Is that specific stakeholder a government agency, an NGO, a company, an association, and so on? And what do they do actually in the landscape? Why is this stakeholder relevant? For example, if you're talking about a plantation company, I mean, they're relevant because they're using land, because they're drawing resources, because they're creating jobs, because they're potentially having a negative impact on soil and water pollution, because they might contribute to increase pressure on forest resources, and so on. Then we need to understand also ourselves to build different intervention scenario. What do we want those stakeholders to do better or to do differently? So, for example, if we're talking about, again, a plantation company, do we want them, for example, to adopt and comply certification standard like FSC, like RSPO, and so on? For a cooperative, would we want them to adopt, better management practices, to switch to agroforestry models, and so on? So it's very important for us to try to understand how we can have an impact by working with those stakeholders, and then on our side to understand what would be the cost and benefits of them basically taking up that opportunity. So obviously, when you change behaviors and practices, it comes with a cost of compliance, a cost of certification, a cost of improved management, and we need to make sure that the incentives associated to the change are larger basically than the cost. For example, by having higher productivity, higher price premiums, reduced operational costs, and so on. So it's very important to do this work prior to engaging the stakeholders to make sure that we have a clear narrative and that we can answer the basic question, what's in for us and how much time and money is it going to take. Then there is another one that I think you're very familiar with that is outlined in the next slide, which basically looks at the level of influence and importance within a specific landscape. And I'm pretty sure everybody has used that already. But what we really want to do in a landscape is to work with primarily the group B, which has high influence and is highly supportive of the agenda for change. So our role as landscape facilitators and conveners will be to find how we can support them and empower them to become champion and to bring about change. One group that we should not undervalue and we should still engage with is Group C, which has still a lot of influence over the landscape, over policy making, over land use, and so on, but that maybe has a lower desire for change. And it's very important to still have a strategy to engage with those stakeholders to make sure that they don't feel alienated, that they feel engaged into the dialogue, and to slowly open up new perspectives for collaboration with them. Okay, so now if we can go to the next slide. So it's also another kind of just to show you the level of detail and complexity of the mapping. So you can look at the supply chain mapping that basically has 3 different levels of complexity. So the basic one is just to do a regular quick and dirty desktop research on the supply chain to understand who are the actors, what are the issues related to specific commodities, and usually there is quite a lot of literature on at least the mainstream commodities. You can go a step further by looking at trade data that will give you more comprehensive information about the actors of the supply chain. And I mean, very often, especially if you are in a landscape that has a lot of informal producers in the landscape, you will need to do a full mapping that will involve a lot more work on the field, consulting with stakeholders, and it will require obviously a lot more time and resources to conduct. So depending on your needs and the stage of development in landscape design, you can resort to either of those methodology. So, okay, this was just to give you a brief overview of what stakeholder mapping means and to give you an understanding of how much work it could entail. And now my colleague Sarah will talk you through the next step, where we will break out into groups to basically draw insight from your work to understand what challenges and opportunities you have been working with in your specific landscapes.